This agreement that we've concluded, it cannot work unless we extend the hand of friendship to those who were once foes. Unless, before we condemn, we at least try to see the other side.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Michael Adams. I'm president of the Nebraska World Affairs Council here in Omaha. And by the way, I should mention I am not related to Jerry Adams, the former head of the political wing of the IRA. But I'm very happy to welcome all of you to today's webinar on the Northern Ireland peace process and its prospects for the future, which I believe you'll find fascinating. Today's event is co-sponsored by the Nebraska World Affairs Council and the B'nai B'rith Breadbreakers group. I'll say a few words about our organization, the Nebraska World Affairs Council, which we affectionately call NEWAC, and then I'll hand it off to my colleague, Gary Javits, who will introduce our guest speaker, Charles Landow. There will be Q&A opportunities following the presentation, so please post any questions, comments in the chat room. So, and I should mention the session is being recorded. It will be available on our YouTube channels shortly. The Nebraska World Affairs Council, our roots go back to 1972. So if you do the math, you'll realize this is our 50th anniversary year, which is great. We're very excited about it. We are a nonpartisan, nonprofit membership organization, and our mission is to provide educational programming as well as engagement opportunities together with a number of partners to our three targeted sectors, which are students, young professionals, and community leaders, so that they may become better informed global citizens in this complex and massively interconnected world that we all live in. We encourage very much citizen-to-citizen diplomacy as a way to promote peace and mutual respect so that we may all thrive together. Our programs cover a wide range of world affairs topics, including issues like food security, conflict resolution, climate, U.S. foreign policy, human rights, international trade, cultural heritage, and international education, just to name a few topics. So I invite all of you to follow us on Facebook and Instagram sites, as well as our website, to learn more about our programs and events. Global citizens are really needed here, so please consider joining us. Thank you. So I will now hand it off to Gary, who will introduce our guest speaker today.
Well, thank you very much, Michael. It's always a pleasure to co-sponsor this NEWAC B'nai B'rith Breadbreakers event. I appreciate the partnership. Before we begin, I usually ask that everybody turn their cell phones off. If you are unmuted and you happen to get a landline call, please mute yourself, and that would be very helpful. As Michael mentioned, we will have questions and answers at the end. With that said, does anybody have an announcement that they would like to share? Okay, B'nai B'rith Breadbreakers has been around for 72 years, and we like to say we get the interesting and the influential, the prominent and the preeminent. And we have a wide variety of speakers every week, as opposed to NEWAC, which has it monthly. And if you're interested in getting on my email list, you could email me at gary.javich@gmail.com. And with that, I am going to introduce our speaker. We are very pleased to have as our guest presenter today, Omaha native Charles Landow, joining us from New York City. He has a fascinating work history, as you will soon learn. I would like to point out, however, that while Charlie has worked with nationally and internationally famous organizations, his remarks, comments, and observations today are his and his alone. Currently, Charlie serves as Chief of Staff to the former U.S. Treasury Secretary Robert E. Rubin. He previously held several roles at the Council on Foreign Relations that included his working directly for CFR President Richard Haas. In 2013, Landow served as Research Director for Haas and Megan O'Sullivan in their capacity as Chair and Vice Chair, respectively, for multi-party political negotiations in Northern Ireland. He also served earlier in his career at the International Labor Organization in Geneva and for Senator Ben Nelson in Chicago. Paul earned a bachelor's degree in political science cum laude from Columbia University and a master's degree in international affairs from Columbia School of International and Public Affairs. His writings on international affairs and philanthropy have appeared in such outlets as the International Herald Tribune, the Wall Street Journal, foreignpolicy.com, and CFR.org, to name a few. Charlie teaches one course per semester at UNO on U.S. foreign policy and can converse in 5 languages, speaking 3 fluently. In case you're wondering, yes, Charlie is related to the late Susan and Dr. Paul Landow, Paul having served as Omaha Mayor Mike Fay's chief of staff and in the political science department at UNO. And before you start, Charlie, Paul, Margot, good to see you. Thank you. And with that, please welcome Charlie Landow.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much, Gary. Thank you to Michael as well. I want to thank NEWAC and thank the Breadbreakers. It's great to be here. It's great to be with folks from Omaha, a lot of familiar names, and really appreciate this opportunity. So thank you all. I am happy to have the opportunity to discuss Northern Ireland and the past and future of that part of the world. It's kind of a moving target nowadays, not only with sort of long running issues, which I will try to get into, but also with the fact that the government in London is changing as we speak. Boris Johnson has announced his resignation. There's a process ongoing to replace him as Prime Minister of the UK. So these things are in flux. But in fact, that's part of the point that I'd like to convey, that we're at a moment of flux. We're at a moment of uncertainty in Northern Ireland and in the UK more broadly. And that's why I think it's particularly interesting to discuss right now. So again, thank you. What I will do is give a brief introduction to Northern Ireland, just to put us all on the same page, an introduction to my involvement there, as you alluded to, Gary. Then I'd like to talk about 2 substantive issues that I think are both very important today. One, very long running, which is the legacy of the conflict in Northern Ireland and how to deal with that. The other, just from the past several years, but still ongoing, which is Brexit and the conundrum of dealing with trade and border issues stemming from that. And then I'll try to conclude by tying together some threads and giving some implications of all this, and we'll go to discussion with everyone. As far as Northern Ireland is concerned, I expect everyone's got some familiarity, but again, just want to lay out maybe a few basics, if that's all right, to get us all on the same page. Northern Ireland is one of the 4 constituent parts of the United Kingdom, along with England, Scotland, and Wales. But unlike those other areas, it sits on the island of Ireland, not on the island of Great Britain. And Northern Ireland has existed in its present form since 1921. They just had a centennial last year. And that was when the island of Ireland was partitioned. It was previously all under the sovereignty of the UK. In 1921, 26 counties became what was called the Irish Free State. That's a precursor to today's sovereign independent country of Ireland. And the other 6 counties became what's called Northern Ireland and remained within the UK. And as that history suggests, throughout its existence, Northern Ireland has been home to a lot of tension, sometimes conflict between 2 different groups. They're very diverse in themselves, but just to paint with a broad brush, one group is called Unionists, Loyalists. Those are generally, not always, but generally Protestants who feel that their identity is British and they therefore wish for Northern Ireland to remain in the United Kingdom. The second group is Nationalists and Republicans, who are generally Catholic, not a total overlap, generally so. And they feel an identity as Irish, then they want Northern Ireland to leave the United Kingdom and join as United Ireland. And starting in the late 60s, as I expect everyone knows, these tensions erupted into an armed conflict, sometimes called the Troubles, that turned out to last for about 3 decades. And it involved a variety of paramilitary groups on both sides. Undoubtedly, the best known is the IRA, the Irish Republican Army, but there were other groups, both on the Republican side and the Loyalist side. There were also, of course, security forces and others involved in the conflict on the part of the UK government. And this conflict resulted in a great deal of tragedy and suffering, more than 3,500 deaths in a very small society. Even today, population of less than 2 million, maybe something similar to Nebraska's. At that time, even smaller population, and families and communities are very tightly connected. So these deaths, as well as injuries and bereavement, really have rippled through the society and through the decades. The conflict more or less came to an end with the Good Friday Agreement, as I expect everyone knows, also called the Belfast Agreement in 1998. And that was reached following negotiations chaired by George Mitchell, great American figure. That remains a landmark in the history of American diplomacy and conflict resolution around the world. Now, the Good Friday Agreement, or Belfast Agreement, did not solve the issue underlying the tensions in Northern Ireland. That is, it did not determine whether Northern Ireland should remain in the UK or become part of Northern Ireland, become part of Ireland, rather. But it did bring that question from the realm of conflict to the realm of peaceful democratic politics. And that is, of course, an enormous achievement. In that regard, the agreement created a process where the only way that Northern Ireland's status could change would be through the consent of its people. And the mechanism for doing that would be someday, perhaps, a referendum where people could decide. And that referendum is to be called by the UK government if it appears that a majority of people in Northern Ireland would vote to leave the UK and join Ireland. That's a condition that is ambiguously defined in the text of the agreement. It's never been more specifically defined. But according to polling and all the other things that I think you would generally consider relevant, that condition has not so far been met. And thus, there has been no referendum and there are no plans for one. The agreement also set up political institutions in what are known as three strands. Strand one is the devolved or local government within Northern Ireland. Strand two is institutions with representatives from Northern Ireland and the Irish Republic. That's the north-south strand. And strand three is east-west. That is representatives from all different parts of Great Britain and the island of Ireland. And those institutions were set up in the years following 1998, and that remains the basic political landscape that we have today. Now, my introduction to Northern Ireland came, as Gary mentioned, in 2013, when I worked on a small team assisting two American diplomats and scholars, Richard Haas and Megan O'Sullivan. Then each of them had previously worked on Northern Ireland issues in the US government. Therefore, the main political parties in Belfast asked them to serve as chair and vice chair of negotiations that the parties themselves decided to have in 2013. And at that time, when I first went there, the institutions that I described set up after 1998, those were broadly working pretty well. You had a Northern Ireland Assembly, that's a unicameral legislature that was functioning. You had an office of the First Minister and Deputy First Minister, that's a joint sort of head office. It has both a Unionist and a Republican leader. Both are required to participate. That was functioning. And you had the executive, which is basically a cabinet that then included representatives from 5 major parties across the spectrum: Unionist, Nationalist, Republican, and non-sectarian. And that power sharing, you could imagine if you had sort of everybody from Bernie Sanders to sort of Trump supporters all theoretically in the same power sharing coalition, probably wouldn't function extremely efficiently, but nonetheless it was functioning, and a little creaky, but it was going, and it represented a major positive change from the pre-1998 era. And it was this set of institutions and this general evolution that I think was responsible for giving Northern Ireland a reputation as a conflict resolution success, broadly speaking. We worked on our negotiations process on 3 issues that the parties themselves had defined. One of those was the legacy of the conflict, which I'll speak more about. I'm happy to get into the others later if you would like. But the parties themselves had set up this process, and they did not reach an agreement as we hoped at the end of that process. But I think the ideas that we developed, the proposals, they did lay the groundwork for further talks for some degree of consensus in the following years, especially on the legacy issue, as I'll describe. More recently, this will conclude my picture of the political landscape. More recently, those devolved institutions have gotten, I think, even a little creakier. They were suspended between early 2017 and early 2020, and they've been partially suspended again since February of this year. And both of those occasions were triggered by the resignation of either the Deputy First Minister, which was Martin McGuinness in 2017, or the First Minister, Paul Given, this February. Because again, the joint office cannot stand unless both individuals are participating. And we see from that, there are good reasons, I think, for what is essentially this mandatory coalition, mandatory power sharing across this very deep divide. You don't want to have a situation where one side of the community could impose legislation and policies on all. It should be a basis of consent across the different viewpoints. But that also makes the system vulnerable to one side choosing not to cooperate. And that is what we're seeing now. So there are, I think, real questions about the post-1998 arrangements and whether reforms are feasible and needed. And I expect that discussion will continue to play out. And I think that sense underlies part of the uncertainty that I noted about how I view, and I think how others view, the current era in Northern Ireland. So with that as a backdrop, I want to talk about, again, two sort of issue areas. The first I'll mention is Brexit. We're now more than 6 years after the initial vote by the people of the UK to leave the European Union. It happened in June of 2016. And here we are still discussing the uncertainties surrounding Brexit and not really knowing exactly what the end point will be. That has been the case, I think, in Northern Ireland, particularly, this long enduring uncertainty. Because there were always three priorities that different and overlapping groups of people had with regard to Brexit in Northern Ireland. There were three priorities, but you could only ever have two. You could choose any two, but never all three. That's my view of it. The three priorities were, first of all, leaving not just the EU, but also the EU's trade arrangements, the customs union and single market. That's the sort of hard Brexit. And that was a desire of Boris Johnson and the Conservatives around him, who had the most influence in London. Second priority was not having any renewed infrastructure on the land border, no checkpoints, no customs posts, and so on the land border between Ireland and Northern Ireland. That infrastructure existed in decades past, and it was removed following the 1998 agreement. And that's seen as a central achievement of the peace process. And therefore resurrecting it to any degree would be seen as a threat to the peace process. That's a widely held view. The third priority was not having any so-called border down the Irish Sea. That means a distinction in trade rules between Great Britain and Northern Ireland, two different parts of the United Kingdom. And not having that distinction has been the primary priority of unionists. But as things turned out, it was that last priority that lost out. And the Northern Ireland Protocol, which was agreed in 2019 by the Johnson government, the UK government, and the European Union, it called for some EU trade rules to apply in Northern Ireland, with the goal of avoiding that border between Northern Ireland, which is part of the UK, and Ireland, which remains part of the EU. To avoid that, then you apply some EU rules in Northern Ireland, and that means basically that you need to have some checks on goods that are going from Great Britain to Northern Ireland, and that's proved to be a major headache since the protocol came into force at the beginning of 2021. We're not talking about obscure items here. We're talking about food products and many other things that are part of people's daily lives. They've had problems keeping supermarkets stocked. They've had a lot of red tape and increased costs for businesses and consumers. COVID has probably played into that, but the protocol really has had an impact. And Boris Johnson was, for a long time, quite slippery about this. That's probably not too surprising for those who follow him, in my opinion. But he tried to minimize the impact of this protocol. He extended grace periods unilaterally. He talked it down. He pretended that there wouldn't need to be checks. Eventually, all this has really kind of come home to roost. Northern Ireland's unionists, as I mentioned in particular, have been extremely upset about this protocol because they see it as weakening Northern Ireland's place in the UK, applying one set of rules to one part of the country, different set of rules to Northern Ireland. So this has continued to be the subject of unceasing negotiations and brinkmanship between the UK government and the EU. We have continued uncertainty. And now the Johnson government just recently has proposed legislation that would allow the UK to unilaterally toss out parts of the protocol. There's a lot of mind-numbing detail to it, but basically they want to give themselves the option to not enforce or to change the rules that were agreed in certain areas with the EU. And the government says this does not breach its obligations. They say it's simply smoothing out the obstacles that the protocol has thrown up. Of course, many others in Brussels and other places say that this is absolutely a violation of the UK's commitments, that it would cause a lot of disruption. And the EU has said it will not renegotiate the protocol. They're open to changes, but so far there has not been common ground. So this remains an impasse. And even as Johnson is on his way out of government in London and people are running to replace him, that bill, which would allow the UK to disregard parts of the protocol, that continues to advance. It was set for action in the House of Commons just today, actually. I'm not sure if that has yet occurred, getting a bit late in the evening over there, but it's expected to move through the House of Commons. Still faces possible opposition in the House of Lords. So we'll have to see if that bill passes as such. But the uncertainty over the bill, I think, is a microcosm of the uncertainty that Brexit continues to cast over Northern Ireland's economy, over its political debate, over the society itself. And all of that, again, shows no signs of fading more than 6 years after the referendum. And a final point on this, I mentioned earlier that the devolved government in Northern Ireland has not been fully functioning since February because of the resignation of First Minister Paul Givan earlier this year. Now, Givan is a member of the Democratic Unionist Party, the main unionist party in Northern Ireland. And they withdrew from that post, collapsing the government over anger about this protocol, over the different rules applied to Northern Ireland and Great Britain. And the party leader, Jeffrey Donaldson, has suggested that if the bill passes, that's pending in Parliament now, that the party will return to the devolved government in Northern Ireland. So that may be part of the reason why some people support it. It may have some beneficial impact in terms of political functioning in Belfast, may have negative impact in other areas. That, of course, is in the eye of the beholder. But the bill holds a lot of importance for not just trade, but for political stability, for the UK's international reputation, and much else. And so that's why I think it is a pretty significant set of issues that remains before us. The second of those big sets of issues that I wanted to cover is the legacy of the conflict. And as I mentioned, this was something that was on our plates in 2013 at the request of the political parties themselves. It's long been a central issue of concern. It was not conclusively addressed at the time. It has not been conclusively addressed since. And we can imagine, of course, the great deal of emotion and sensitivity that attends this set of issues in a deeply divided society that has suffered so much. When I worked on this issue in 2013, I found that it had a large number of strands. And some of these have some elements in common with other societies that have gone through conflict and navigated post-conflict processes, which I don't know nearly as much about, but I'd be happy to try to get into that a little more later if you'd like. There's one question involving justice, meaning judicial proceedings, investigations, potential convictions, and punishment related to fatalities from the conflict years. There are still reported to be more than 1,000 unsolved killings from Northern Ireland's conflict. And this issue in Northern Ireland has several pieces to it. There are police investigations that could possibly lead to trials. There are special inquiries that are commissioned by the government, sometimes over the most visible events. There is a type of investigation called coroner's inquest, and there are many other vehicles that families and advocates have sought to use under relevant law to try to advance accountability that they might like for events involving themselves and their loved ones. These investigations have generally been very slow moving. I think a lot of people have done heroic work on them, but they're generally slow moving. They've rarely led to trials in recent years, much less convictions, as you would imagine, given the passage of time, now at least 2-3 decades since these events occurred, the degradation of evidence, the degradation of memories, people passing away, and other factors that make it very difficult at this point to pursue that avenue. At the same time, many families and others across Northern Ireland have had a strong interest in simply receiving more information about their loved ones, I'll call it information recovery, maybe helping to achieve some closure, some greater knowledge about what occurred. And how to advance that aim, perhaps alongside a judicial component, was a big challenge that we tried to grapple with, and it remains a big challenge. And of course, we can understand how these things are connected. If you're asking former leaders of paramilitary groups, for example, to give information about killings that group may have carried out. People would be wary of doing so, of course, if they believe the information could be used against them in court. So perhaps you want to have a process that separates those two things. There's also demands on the UK government to give information about the actions of its security forces. A government, of course, has a much different set of practices and records and so on than a paramilitary group may have. There can be imbalances there that people perceive. And so all of this is enormously challenging. And then looking out, most broadly, we have the question of reconciliation, of helping people express their own narratives of the conflict, maybe hear the narratives of others, come to perhaps not agreement, but greater understanding of how these events affected everyone across the society. And you want to try to foster all that to help people move ahead in a unified way. But again, those efforts have faced enormous challenges, despite what I think is tremendous work by many people. And I don't think we've seen anything conclusive on these issues since we did the work in 2013. So there was in 2014 something called the Stormont House Agreement, which used the proposals that the Haas-O'Sullivan team developed in 2013 as a basis. And that agreement was reached, but the plans called for on these legacy issues were never put into place. And the years went by, and this continues to be, I think, a field or a canvas on which Northern Ireland's sectarian divisions can play out. One side pushes for investigations of the other side. Families and advocates pursue many different interests. And again, time goes on with even more limited prospect, perhaps, of judicial resolution for those who wish to see that. And it was this context, it was in this context that the UK government made a proposal last year that essentially called for an amnesty for killings during the conflict. It called this a statute of limitations, basically saying investigations are going to stop. There will be no more investigations. There will be no more trials. And instead, we're going to focus our efforts on information recovery and on sharing information with families and on reconciliation. And that proposal, sort of a pre-proposal, it caused an outcry. It caused basically universal opposition in Northern Ireland, also among folks on Capitol Hill in this country who follow the issue, and among the international human rights community. Many people object to removing the prospect of prosecutions, lack of accountability. They want to see that in their own case. They believe it's the UK's obligation as a sovereign government, many reasons. And some will accuse the UK government of trying to protect veterans of the British Army, veterans of the police forces, who might have been involved in events in Northern Ireland during that period. Many people also argue that this proposal departed from the UK's commitments under the Stormont House Agreement, which I mentioned. And so perhaps responding to this outcry, the UK government did not advance that proposal that it first mooted last year. But this May, it introduced a revised proposal, which would again offer immunity from prosecution, but it would make that immunity contingent on a person's cooperation with information recovery efforts, with a new commission that would be set up. You'd have to give good faith information in order to benefit from immunity. And if you don't, in theory, you could still be prosecuted. So that is perhaps a response to those reactions that we saw to the proposal last year, but nonetheless, they have not satisfied advocates and others who believe that this immunity violates the UK's commitments or that they oppose this proposal. So it continues to face a lot of opposition. But nonetheless, just as with the other bill that I mentioned on the Northern Ireland Protocol, this bill for this conditional immunity, the legacy bill, that does continue to advance. It has passed all the necessary steps in the House of Commons. It's expected to go to the House of Lords this fall. So we'll continue to see various arguments. And if it does pass, I expect we'll continue to see legal proceedings about its validity. So I would say, despite what we're seeing now, the legacy issue is not behind us for good, not by any means. So with that said, I'll wrap up by getting to a few implications of all this as I see them. I think the big future question that we see most discussed today, that I'd be curious for all of your views on, is the prospect of a referendum on a united Ireland, as I mentioned, which could be held under the terms of the Good Friday or Belfast Agreement. I don't view that as an imminent prospect. There's a lot of talk about it for sure, but I don't view it as imminent. As I mentioned, polling results, other metrics you might look at have not shown a majority in favor of United Ireland. I'm happy to get more into that. But Brexit, of course, has brought this topic much more to the fore. In addition, in elections for the Northern Ireland Assembly in May, just a couple of months ago, Sinn Féin, the main Irish Republican Party, won the most seats in the Assembly for the first time ever. That's a political earthquake. It's always been a unionist with the most, a unionist party with the most seats. And this is the first time that that's not the case. So that gives Sinn Féin the right to nominate the first minister, which again would be the first time that has occurred. But the Democratic Unionist Party will need to nominate a deputy first minister in order for that to happen. And that has not yet occurred, so we will see. But either way, Sinn Féin's victory, the continued disillusionment over Brexit, and the evolution of Northern Ireland's demographics with a growth in the Catholic share of the population relative to the Protestant share, they all give a sense of momentum to the prospect of a border referendum, even though I think that's not a prospect for the next year or two. But I think the increased focus on this likely makes it harder for parties to cooperate, makes unionists feel that more is at stake. In some way, the very existence of Northern Ireland, as they see it, is at stake. And Sinn Féin and others will continue exercising pressure in favor of a referendum. And that makes the politics much more difficult than I think they already have been. And that contributes to the uncertainty over what will occur in Northern Ireland and the stability there. There's continued uncertainty over the trade arrangements. As I mentioned, that has implications for the economy. It's a difficult time period in the UK economy, facing, just as we are here, a very high inflation, continued ripple effects from the pandemic, and Brexit adding on to that. And the uncertainty over Brexit also it keeps the relationship much tenser than it could be between the UK and the European Union. And that's a time when we want to see cooperation and unity in Europe and in transatlantic relations over Ukraine and the many other challenges we face around the world. So that has, I think, pretty big consequences. And then finally, on the legacy issues that I discussed, again, a lot of uncertainty. A few different paths, I think, are possible. One is that the status quo basically will continue, and we'll continue to see investigations and so on, largely not leading to successful prosecutions. Time will continue to pass, and perhaps the status quo will just evolve with people fading from the scene. Or the UK government could, of course, pass its proposal, or there could be some new proposal that commands a greater degree of consensus about how to handle these investigations and prosecutions and other questions. I think a big new proposal that everyone agrees to is probably pretty unlikely. Many people, including the team that I worked on, have tried to promote that, and it hasn't yet occurred. But whatever happens, I don't think the issue will be put to rest legally, and I don't think the issue will be put to rest in the minds of victims and survivors. And I think it's difficult, unfortunately, to envision a lot of movement toward reconciliation. Now, the counter argument to this, in a way, is that many people, including younger people, don't necessarily see themselves as tied to either of the two traditional identities in Northern Ireland. And a party called Alliance, the non-sectarian party, which calls itself neither unionist nor nationalist, has shown a great deal of growth in elections in recent years. So maybe with time, some of this venom from the past will fade, even without any particular proposal. But legacy will remain, I think, something hanging over the society and something that people will continue to contest. And so I think we're in a real period of uncertainty involving the economy, the political structures, the direction of the society, and perhaps a little bit more in the future, the ultimate question of Northern Ireland's status, a part of the UK or part of a united Ireland. So I don't claim to know, of course, how all this plays out, but what I do think is the era that followed 1998, where there was imperfect but steady progress in implementing political institutions and building on the peace process, that era, I think, is over. Doesn't mean we're going back to the past, but I do think the future has a lot of uncertainty. So again, I want to thank all of you for being here and for the opportunity, and I look forward to continuing our discussion.
Gary, are you there?
Yes, I had some background noise that I didn't want to have you be distracted by. So as far as questions and answers are concerned, and I know there are several, you can use the reaction button at the bottom of the screen to raise your hand, or you can wave. So, I forgot I turned this off because of the background noise. Or you could wave like this, and I will call on you. So with that, if you have a preface to your question, try not to make it too long, so we could have brief questions and brief answers, and more people can participate that way. So let's start with Lisa Lewis, who had her hand up.
Sorry, I was applauding.
Oh,
Thank you, Charlie. I drove him.
Thank you, Lisa.
Yeah.
Thank you. Good. Happy to see you.
other questions? Rich, Jiro, you always have great questions. Where'd you go?
Gary, there's 2 questions in the chat.
Okay, thank you. All right. So are the questions, Charlie, and Charlie, you need to unmute yourself. Are the
Yep.
neighborhoods and marriages still divided by religion?
Yeah. I think less so, but still much more than you would like. I was never there before 2013, but from everything I've heard and folks I've talked to, in prior eras, the street by street, people would feel welcome or unwelcome, and they would choose where they would go for shopping and public transportation and all that based on a very precise map of their neighborhood and other neighborhoods. That's speaking mostly about Belfast. Rural areas may be a little different. I think that we've seen, some improvement in that, in the sense that, from what I understand, Belfast is much less sort of security presence than it had during the conflict era. In particular, going into downtown Belfast, where there's, all the things you would see, shops and restaurants and things like that, people go there and you don't have your car getting inspected like you might have in previous decades and things like that. At the same time, the so-called peace walls, which divide certain neighborhoods, they go along what are called interface areas, where there are unionist or loyalist neighborhoods abutting Republican neighborhoods. Those walls are still up. There's dozens of those in Belfast. You can pass through them. It's not like a Berlin Wall situation. There's not, armed guards. There will be a gate on certain streets that allow you to go from one place to the other. But the high wall still exists. It's intended, I think, to prevent projectiles and other things like that from going across. And sometimes those things still occur. And I think people still do have a mental map of kind of who lives where and where they might want to go or not want to go. And so, yes, I think the answer is still divided. I think some of those have faded. I think marriages, I'd have to check on the latest numbers. Again, I think there's a younger generation, many more of whom see their identity as transcending that traditional divide. But, it's still a place that's divided. It's still a place where you have events that cause a lot of strife. It's still a place where, you see pretty starkly, based sometimes on flags and lampposts and other things like that, kind of which part of town you're in, very much.
okay, thank you. Another question. Since the armed conflict has ceased, has the economy of Northern Ireland caught up with the rest of the UK, for example, in attracting outside industrial investment?
Yeah, that's a good question, Michael. Thank you. I don't believe that it has caught up by standard metrics. I think there's no doubt, the south of England is far and away the most prosperous part of the UK. That's London and areas relatively close to London. And in Northern Ireland, just as with, I think, other parts in the north of England, for example, doesn't have the same, I have to check to make sure, but I don't believe it's ever had, sort of similar levels of GDP per capita, similar levels of prosperity. However, there has been a good deal of investment in Northern Ireland in the post-1998 era, in particular by American companies. It's a good back office location in a way. It's obviously an English-speaking place. It's geographically kind of between Europe and North America, essentially the closest place in Europe that you get to when you fly over, and services companies, I think, some amount of industry, but I think also services companies, insurance, banking, things like that have set up some operations in Northern Ireland. And so, there's a lot of people in America who are interested in this issue for one reason or another. And the business sector, the American business sector, has been part of that. So I think they have attracted a good deal of investment, which has been highly beneficial. I think Brexit, may upset that a little bit. I think it's hard at this point to disentangle like which economic trends are due to Brexit and which are due to COVID, because everything's obviously been kind of pretty messed up with supply chains and growth and so on for the last couple of years. But in theory, with the Northern Ireland Protocol I mentioned, some of its advocates, or some people who may be just trying to make the best of the situation, will argue that the protocol could be a great benefit to Northern Ireland because it's the only place in the world, essentially, that has full access to the UK market, a prosperous country in its own right, and full access to the EU market for goods. And so if you make something in Northern Ireland, actually, you ought to have a pretty good chance of selling that into the UK or selling it into the entirety of the EU. And companies could take advantage of that. So far, I think that's been limited, again, because there's been so much uncertainty of the rules, and a lot of people are more focused on what they feel is the injustice of this protocol rather than perhaps what advantages it could bring. So Brexit, I think causes barriers to trade for the UK economy as a whole, and Northern Ireland remains part of that, but it may also provide special opportunities that with time could benefit investment in Northern Ireland.
Gary, you're muted, Gary.
Thank you, Sari. A question emailed to me. It's a little long, so I'll paraphrase it. So Ireland has, over the last number of years, developed a reputation as being very business friendly.
Yeah.
But at the same time, they've also been overtly anti-Semitic, especially in relationship to Israel. Does Northern Ireland, does Northern Ireland share those same types of feelings?
Yeah.
I think that's probably an educated guess type answer.
Yeah, I'm not totally sure that I know the reference. I think Sinn Féin and maybe some of the other Irish parties express an affinity with the Palestinian cause, and it strikes me that may be the reference being made in the question. It's not an area I'm extremely familiar with. I think in Northern Ireland, well, Sinn Féin is a party that competes in both jurisdictions.
Right.
They're, as I mentioned, currently the largest party following the most recent election in Northern Ireland. They're the sort of main opposition party in the Irish Republic. I think they aspire to be part of the government there, but they never have been. If that's the voice you're talking about, then yeah, it would be a similar policy in both jurisdictions. I've never had the sense that policy toward the Middle East is a major issue in Northern Ireland, simply because foreign policy is made in London. And we don't tend to see politicians in Belfast, I think, focusing much on relations with the rest of the world. They do come up, certainly relations with the US and so on, but it wouldn't be as much of a focus. Dublin, of course, it's a sovereign country. It's got its own foreign policy. Might be more of an issue there. I think that's the best I could answer that question. I can talk about the business environment. Yeah.
Yeah, and ironically, Dublin had at one time a Jewish mayor. So sometime
Yeah.
years, they changed their feelings towards Israel.
Yeah, that may be. It may depend a little bit on who's in place at the time. But that's something I'm going to look more into, and I appreciate the question. Yeah,
Okay.
I think to say briefly on the business environment, I think Ireland, the Republic of Ireland, for a long time has had a very low corporate tax.
I think about
they've actually
11%.
Yeah, I think that's right. It has attracted a great deal of international business presence, including all these tech companies and so on that set up operations in Ireland. Northern Ireland has not had that same tax rate. It's higher. I believe they do have the power to set their own corporate tax rate in Northern Ireland, but have not gone to the same level, I don't believe. And in any case, there's now this international agreement. It still needs to be put into place. I was just reading about it yesterday. But that the Biden administration has struck with a number of other countries, including Ireland, to have a minimum corporate tax and to change the way that that's enforced on multinational companies. So I don't know if that'll change things a little bit, but that's very much a feature, much more so of Ireland than Northern Ireland, as far as that tax regime and the presence of multinationals. Yeah.
Rich Giro had a question.
First of all, thank you for your presentation. My question is, in Israel, there's the Druze. Are there any significant minority or sect in Northern Ireland? What are their feelings?
Yeah, that's a good question, Rich. Thank you. As far as religious minorities, I don't believe so. I've not heard anything about that. Of course, you have folks who may be neither Catholic nor Protestant. I know that there has been through the years a small Jewish community in Belfast. Certainly, there would be smaller communities of Muslims and Hindus and so on, like you would find in anywhere. I think the group that comes to mind in response to your question is certain groups of immigrants from other parts of Europe. I think that the Polish community is the largest of those groups in Northern Ireland, if I'm not mistaken. A lot of people from Eastern Europe came to the UK after some of those Eastern European states were admitted to the European Union. Then you had rights of free rights of movement, and so I think the Polish community is the largest. I suspect there may be Jewish folks in that group. That I suspect they're mainly Catholic. I don't know. I haven't seen specifically if they have viewpoints that have been measured specifically on some of these political issues in Northern Ireland. It's an interesting question. You don't hear about it very much, but I believe as far as sort of population groups outside those that we would think of most often, I think people from Poland, maybe a couple other parts of Europe, are the ones that you tend to see the most about, and maybe have a small influence, but aren't a big part of the debate. I don't think.
Are a follow-up, are there any significant Ukrainians or Syrians or Iraqis or even Turks?
Yeah, it's a good question. If I could get back to you, I'd be happy to look into it. I just don't know. I haven't heard about it. That doesn't mean that there aren't. Obviously, there have been refugees, that the UK takes in. They may have settled there, but I'd like to look into it more.
Here's another quick one.
Yeah.
When will you be back at UNO again teaching?
Oh, well, as soon as the fall semester starts, I'll be teaching, but that'll be online, as I've always taught online, which has been a wonderful opportunity. So yeah, even before COVID and all that, I've been living outside of Omaha, and I have been teaching online. And I do have a course that I'll be starting up just next month when the semester starts. That's a seminar on foreign policy, which I really enjoy. So I'll be doing that again. Yeah.
Do you have an idea of the course number or the title?
Yeah, it's a seminar in U.S. foreign policy, and I believe it's political science 8200.
Wow. So is that graduate level?
It is, yeah, it's a master's level course. Yeah. Yeah. But I've taught undergrad and master's level, and it's been just fantastic now for 6 or 7 years. And that's the second course I've taught mainly always U.S. foreign policy, but there's a sort of broad U.S. foreign policy course that I've had, and then there's also the seminar, and I really really enjoyed both, and it's just fantastic to be connected to Omaha still. So,
well, very good. Go ahead, David Alloy has a question.
Let me unmute. Okay. There's a little thing going on next month called a football game that Nebraska is going to be playing. And my wife and I are going on a 9-day tour, but only one of the days is in Belfast, Northern Ireland. And I know part of that tour there for that one day is going to be the Titanic exhibit. If we were to go back to, and the other 8 days are in Ireland, if we were to go back, what's a good amount of days to spend in Northern Ireland to catch, not just the food and the people and a little bit of shopping, but historical sites? What is a fair amount of days that you could estimate to do that?
Yeah, that's fantastic. Belfast is not a huge city, so I think a few days in Belfast, you'd be able to see what you probably would like to see. The Titanic is one big thing, and then there's a few other. Well, I think a great thing to do in Belfast is take like a taxi tour or a similar tour where you can see, they'll take you to the Peace Walls. There's a bunch of famous murals and other sites where different events happen, and with a good, I think quite often it is actually a black cab driver, the black cars that the traditional taxis in that part of the world. They're very knowledgeable if you find a good one, and they can take you around and also narrate what you're seeing. There's a few other interesting sites in Belfast. There's a historic jail that's been converted, and you can go visit. But it's not a massive city, so a couple 3 days in Belfast, and then after that it would be up to your interest. I mean, I've actually never been. I would like to. I've never been to Derry or Londonderry, which is the second city out to the west. They have also some historic sites, city walls, some things tied to the conflict. There's a peace bridge. So that might be another day. That's a couple hours from Belfast by car. Not, you don't have to fly, but a couple of days. And then there's some beautiful areas. It may be tied to your interests and what historic events maybe you want to look at. But if you're also interested in natural beauty, you could drive certain areas of the coast. The Giant's Causeway is the number one sort of natural site in Northern Ireland. It's a formation of rocks along the coastline at the very north in County Antrim. That's beautiful. That's, I think, pretty near the Bushmills distillery. Maybe you'd like to see the distillery and have some whiskey. So there's things like that, that could take up a few extra days. I don't know. I hope that's helpful.
Yes, very much. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Anybody else here going to the football game? And nope. Okay, just curious.
Yeah.
Other questions? Margot or Paul, do you have one for your son, son-in-law, so to speak? Your dad left the room. Oh, he came back. Okay.
Strategically.
You have to unmute yourself, Paul.
Yeah.
Go ahead, you're on.
I have a question. What lessons can we learn from the Good Friday Agreement that might be applicable to the Middle East?
Yeah, I think you probably know, the folks here know a great deal more about the Middle East than I do. To me, is thinking about the two situations, maybe the number one thing that comes to mind is you need to have leaders that are committed to the cause of peace and to making decisions that can bring peace about, and that have enough standing in their communities to bring people along, because it will be difficult. I mean, we know that. There was, I think, a confluence of those factors in the 90s. George Mitchell, very skillfully sort of cultivated them. That allowed the agreement to be reached. That you had leaders who had great standing in their community, had a degree of unity in their community, and who decided, that they saw enough interest in making the sacrifice and giving something to the other side, and that's what happened. I think you would need the same, of course, in the Middle East. I mean, I'm not the first person to observe this by any means, but I think and I probably credit my old boss Richard Haas for a lot of these insights. He's worked on the Middle East as well, but when you think about the Israeli leaders and the Palestinian leaders that we've seen in recent years and decades, I think at times there have been really strong leaders who might have had the ability to convince their populations of certain things, but chose not to make certain concessions. At other times, you might have had leaders that were willing to make more concessions, but couldn't bring their people along. The question of, do you have a partner? So you need just all these sets of factors. I think there's nothing new under the sun here. But at the moment, I guess I would say that you do need to give both sides, some part of the loaf. You can't expect anyone to agree to zero part of the loaf. Maybe a half loaf, maybe a quarter loaf, whatever the case may be. If you don't give the other side something, you obviously risk the prospect that people will not accept the agreement that you've reached, even if the leader does, and that you'll have continued instability. And in Northern Ireland, I think there was, through this highly complex and delicate structure, which is under strain, but a highly complex and delicate structure in the Good Friday Agreement that did succeed in giving folks enough that they all felt that their interests could be better served by peace than continued conflict. And as you know better than I do, such a point has just never quite been reached in the Middle East.
That was fairly insightful because I think related to the Israel-Palestinian issue, evidence demonstrates that unfortunately the Palestinians have walked away from every peace offer without no commitment to peace, no counter proposal since way before 1948. Every single one, with the best chance perhaps Bill Clinton in 2000 or Ehud Olmert in 2008. One last question before we go. Excuse me. Sorry.
Nope. Bless
you. You are working for the former U.S. Secretary of the Treasury. I am being asked to ask you. And by the way, I was fortunate enough to interview him for the Jewish Press. I found him to be extremely interesting.
When was that?
Say, what are some of the kinds of things that you do for him?
Yeah. When was that interview, by the way, Gary?
Oh, God, at least 10, 15 years ago.
Yeah.
He was active Secretary of the Treasury, so it's got to be even more than that because it was during.
So while he was in office, in the 90s then, okay.
Yeah.
Interesting. Maybe I'll see if we can dig that up. It'd be fun to show it to him. Yeah, well, thank you. The main thing that I advise him, broadly speaking, on writing and speaking engagements that he does, and he has some emeritus roles. He has some involvement with continued involvement in the financial sector, a place called Centerview. I don't do as much with that. I do more with his kind of intellectual work on economic policy and foreign policy. And he is writing a book, which has been the main project, that we've had now for a little while. And he's writing a book that is broadly about decision making and about his approach to public policy issues some issues in careers and finance and things like that. And so it's sort of not a memoir. He did write a memoir earlier in life after leaving office in 2003, which is a terrific book. But so this will be a personal book, though, but that looks at a number of policy and other issues, and that is forthcoming probably next spring or thereabouts. So that's what we've been working on. That's probably the main thing that keeps me busy day to day. Yeah.
And so you're doing research on various topics for
Yeah,
it?
exactly. Yeah.
Sounds
So we
very
help, big process for, editing, revising, getting these darn things published. So there's, a lot of steps to it, and we try to help with that.
Yes. Well, it sounds like you have just the most fascinating type of job. And we
No,
certainly,
I'm lucky.
we certainly appreciate your sharing your insights from your experiences, actual on the job experiences in the negotiation process with Northern Ireland. So again, we thank you, and I thank everyone who has attended today. Yes, thank you, David.
Thank you.
Applause for that. You've been most enlightening, very insightful, and very much appreciated. And with that, we are adjourned.
Thank you very much. Thank you all.
Thank you, Charlie.
Thanks.